The morning Jacob Hartley rode into Miller's Hollow to trade for seed, he noticed the trees along the creek looked different than they should have looked in late May. He stopped his horse at the edge of the settlement, trying to understand what was wrong. It was May 28th, 1840, in the Ozark Hills of what would eventually become southern Missouri. Jacob sat on his horse, looking at oak trees that should have been fully leafed by this point in the season, but that stood bare against the morning sky, not budding, not showing new growth, just bare branches like they had stood in March. The ride from Jacob's farm had taken most of the morning, covering 10 miles of rough trail through forest that was thick with late spring growth. The dogwoods had finished blooming weeks ago. The redbuds were long past their early April color. The oaks and hickories had leafed out fully by mid-May, creating the dense green canopy that made summer travel through these hills feel like moving through tunnels of living shade. Jacob had ridden through all of that normal late May abundance. But somewhere in the last mile of approach to Miller's Hollow, the forest had changed. The transition had not been gradual. There had been a point where the forest had shifted from full spring growth to bare winter branches. He dismounted and walked forward slowly, leading his horse. The bark appeared normal, showed no signs of disease or fire damage. The branches were intact, but the buds were either absent entirely or still sealed tight, still dormant, still waiting for spring that had apparently not arrived in this particular valley. Jacob reached up and touched a low-hanging branch. The bark felt normal, rough and textured. The wood beneath was solid, showed no signs of rot or death. This was a living tree that should be producing leaves, but was not. The settlement of Miller's Hollow consisted of perhaps a dozen cabins scattered along both sides of a creek that ran through a narrow valley. Jacob had been coming here for 3 years since the settlement had been established. He knew most of the residents by name, had traded with them regularly, had shared work during harvest seasons. The Miller family, Samuel and Margaret and their 4 children, had been among the first to settle in the hollow. Samuel had built a small mill on the creek that processed corn and wheat for families throughout the region. The mill made the hollow a center of economic activity. Jacob had last been to the hollow 3 weeks before, in early May. Everything had been normal during that visit. Samuel had been in good health, had talked about his plans for spring planting, had mentioned that he had seed wheat available if Jacob wanted to trade for it later in the month. The settlement had been thriving, children playing, animals being tended, work being done in preparation for the growing season. But now, approaching the Miller cabin on this late May morning, Jacob saw none of that activity. No smoke rose from chimneys, no sounds of voices or livestock, just silence and stillness and bare trees. Jacob reached the Miller cabin and stopped a few yards from the door. He called out, announcing his presence. "Samuel! Margaret! It's Jacob Hartley." No answer came, no door opened, no face appeared at a window. Jacob walked to the door and knocked. He waited, listening for sounds of movement inside. He heard nothing. He tried the latch. The door was not locked. The door swung open when Jacob pushed it, revealing the cabin's interior. The main room was dim after the brightness outside. When Jacob's eyes adjusted, he saw that the room was empty of people, but full of the things that people left behind when they were present and living normal lives. The table stood in the center with 4 chairs positioned around it. On the table sat plates and cups, arranged as if for a meal. The hearth held ashes that showed no sign of recent fire. Jacob stepped inside, his boots making sounds on the wooden floor that echoed in ways they should not echo if people were present. The cabin was cold, not frozen, but cold in the way that buildings became when no fire had burned for days or weeks. He moved through the main room slowly. Shelves held dishes and cups, tools for cooking and cleaning, sacks of grain and flour. Everything appeared to be in its proper place, showed no signs of hasty packing. Along another wall hung clothing on wooden pegs, Samuel's work coat, Margaret's shawl, smaller items that would belong to the children. If the family had left, they had not taken the extra clothing that a journey would require. Jacob walked to the back of the cabin, where the sleeping area was partially separated by a curtain. 2 beds occupied the sleeping area. Both beds were made with care, blankets pulled tight, tucked in at the corners, smoothed flat. This detail troubled Jacob more than anything else. People who were fleeing danger did not take time to make their beds with precision. This suggested morning routine, people who expected to return that evening. Jacob returned to the main room and stood in its center. Everything suggested a cabin that was occupied and maintained. Everything except the temperature and the silence and the complete absence of the people who should have been here. He went back outside. The sun had climbed higher while he had been inside. The day had warmed slightly, though the air in the hollow still felt cooler than it should. Jacob walked to the next nearest cabin, which belonged to the Thompson family. He found the same thing: door unlocked, interior empty, possessions in place, beds made, hearth cold. The similarity was striking. Both families were absent, but both cabins showed the same evidence of interrupted routine. Jacob moved through the hollow systematically over the next 2 hours, checking every cabin. The pattern held consistent. 12 cabins, all empty, all showing the same signs of recent occupation without current occupants. Family after family, cabin after cabin, absence compounding until Jacob had confirmed what seemed impossible. An entire settlement had vanished. By early afternoon, Jacob had completed his search of the settlement proper. He stood in the center of the hollow, in the open space where the trail widened, trying to make sense of what he was witnessing. He walked to the nearest large oak and examined it thoroughly. The tree was perhaps 40 feet tall, old enough to have been growing here long before the settlement was established. Jacob put his hand on the bark, felt the solidity of living wood beneath. The tree was alive, but not responding to seasonal cues that should have triggered growth weeks ago. He walked to the edge of the hollow, to the boundary where the valley floor began to rise toward the surrounding ridges. Within perhaps 10 yards, the extreme lack of spring in the hollow gave way to normal late May growth. Trees outside the boundary were fully leafed. Trees inside were bare. Jacob crossed back and forth several times. The boundary was sharp, definite. He checked the gardens that some families had planted. The soil was prepared, showed evidence of recent work, but no seeds had been sown, or if seeds had been planted, nothing had germinated. He checked the barns, empty of animals that should have been kept for summer. If the families had left and taken their animals, that would suggest planned departure. But planned departure contradicted everything else. The sun was approaching its noon position when Jacob accepted that he needed others to witness this, to help search, to confirm the wrongness was real. He mounted his horse and rode out of the valley, watching the transition as he crossed back into normal forest. The ride to Samuel Potter's farm took an hour. Potter was outside splitting wood when Jacob arrived, his face showing concern when he saw Jacob's expression. "What's wrong?" Potter asked. Jacob explained what he had found: the empty cabins, the missing families, the trees that had not leafed out. Potter listened carefully. "You're certain they're all gone?" "I checked every cabin, every single one." Potter nodded. "I'll come, and I'll bring others." Over the next day, Potter spread word to nearby farms. By the following morning, 6 men had gathered at Jacob's farm: Potter himself, William Crawford and his son, Robert Price, James Morrison, and Henry Foster. All of them knew families who lived in Miller's Hollow. They rode together toward the hollow. As they approached, Jacob warned them about what they would see. The transition was visible from a distance, a line where green ended and bare branches began. The men stopped their horses at that boundary, staring. "That's not possible," Foster said quietly. They rode into the hollow together. Jacob showed them the Miller cabin. The men searched other cabins independently. After an hour, they regrouped. Morrison spoke first. "All empty. Same pattern in every one. No tracks leading away," Price added. They organized into search parties, working outward from the settlement. Jacob and Foster headed north. The forest showed deer tracks, turkey scratchings, nothing human. They covered 3 square miles before sunset. When the groups returned, all reported the same. Nothing found. "We check other settlements," Foster said. "Ask if anyone's seen them." Over the following week, they spread word throughout the region. The pattern emerged: hollow residents seen in early May, then nothing after that first week. More men joined the search. They covered caves, hollows, creek beds. 2 weeks of systematic effort. Nothing. No bodies, no camps, no evidence of passage. By mid-June, the organized search ended. Jacob continued visiting the hollow weekly through June and into July. Each visit showed empty cabins and trees that remained bare while the surrounding forest progressed through summer. He noticed other details. Grass barely grew. Birds avoided the hollow. The creek water stayed cold even in July heat. In late July, Martha insisted on seeing it. The transition struck her visibly. She gasped, crossing from green forest to bare branches. They walked through the hollow together. After a long silence, Martha spoke. "We should leave this area. Move somewhere far from here." Jacob nodded. He'd been thinking the same. Then Martha stopped. "Jacob, the Miller cabin door." He looked. The door stood wide open. "I closed that," Jacob said. 3 days ago, I latched it." They approached slowly. Inside, Jacob felt his chest tighten. The table, where plates had sat untouched for months, was different. The plates had been moved, not knocked over. Moved deliberately, rearranged, as if someone had sat down and shifted them. "I didn't touch those," Jacob said. Martha's voice was quiet. "No one's been here in weeks." They stood staring at the table. The plates were dusty, ancient, but they had moved. Outside, they checked other cabins. At the Thompson place, a chair faced the window now. Jacob remembered it at the table. At the Price cabin, the sleeping curtain was tied open. Small changes, deliberate changes. They left quickly. Martha didn't speak on the ride home. That night, she said what Jacob had been avoiding. Whatever happened there, it's not finished happening. But it was the next visit, 2 days later, that made Jacob certain they needed to leave. He rode to the hollow alone at dawn, carrying his axe. He'd decided to try something that had been nagging at him. He would cut into one of the bare trees, see if the wood inside was alive or dead, see if there was any physical explanation for why these trees would not leaf. He chose a smaller oak, at the edge of the settlement, positioned his axe, and swung hard into the trunk. The blade bit into bark and wood, with a sound that was normal, the solid thunk of steel meeting living tree. Jacob pulled the axe free and examined the cut. The wood was green, fresh, alive. Sap began to seep from the wound slowly. He raised the axe to swing again, and stopped, From somewhere in the hollow, from no direction he could identify, came a sound. Not loud, not threatening, but distinct. A breath, or something like a breath. Air moving through space that should have been empty. Jacob stood with the axe raised, listening. The sound did not repeat, but the silence that followed felt different than the silence before. Felt occupied. He lowered the axe slowly, stepped back from the tree. The cut he had made was seeping sap that looked dark, almost black against the pale wood. He did not swing again. He returned to his horse and rode out of the hollow without looking back. The axe, still in his hand, his heart beating faster than exertion alone would explain. That night, he told Martha what he had heard. She didn't question whether it was real. She simply began packing. By September, Jacob and Martha had decided to relocate. Other families in the area made similar decisions. The hollow had created fear throughout the region. Jacob made one final visit to the hollow in late September, just before they left. The trees stood bare, while the surrounding forest showed autumn color. He stood in the center of the settlement for a long time, looking at cabins that had housed families he knew. He turned his horse and rode out of the hollow for the last time, watching as bare branches became autumn foliage, watching wrongness give way to normal. Within a week they had left the area entirely, moved west into territory where Miller's Hollow was unknown. Jacob kept a journal during his years in Missouri. The journal was published by descendants decades after his death. The final entry, dated September 30th, 1840, was brief. Made last visit to the hollow today. Nothing has changed. Trees still bare, cabins still empty, cold still present despite season. We leave tomorrow for lands to the west. I cannot shake feeling that remaining near that place would invite whatever took its people to take us as well. May God protect those who come after, and may they have wisdom to avoid valley where spring will not come. Jacob Hartley died in 1872, having lived his last 3 decades far from Miller's Hollow. The hollow remained empty through the years that followed. Other people visited, some drawn by curiosity, some trying to claim abandoned land. Several families attempted to settle during the 1840s and 1850s. None lasted more than a few weeks. They reported that seeds would not germinate in the cold ground, that cultivation was impossible. They reported other things as well. Sounds in the night, dreams of people asking for help that could not be given, the sense of being watched. By the 1860s, the hollow was completely abandoned. The cabins collapsed. The clearings returned to forest. But the trees remained bare. Botanists who visited in later decades found stands of oak and hickory that showed no leaves regardless of season. They took samples, tested soil and water, found nothing conclusive. The trees were alive, but dormant in ways that defied explanation. Modern hikers occasionally report finding patches of forest where trees have no leaves, where temperature drops noticeably, or it's where the air feels wrong. Most leave quickly, but a few understand they are standing in Miller's Hollow, standing in permanent winter. In the spring of 1892, a county surveyor named William Marsh was mapping property boundaries in the region. His report, filed with the county land office, contained a troubling notation. The stand of dormant oaks, marking the former Miller settlement, has extended approximately 15 yards south-southwest from its position, as recorded in the 1851 survey. Measurements verified twice. The boundary has shifted. When questioned, Marsh insisted his measurements were precise. The line of bare trees had moved outward. His report was dismissed as surveying error. But families living nearest to the hollow know to check the tree line each spring after the thaw, when the rest of the forest leaves out. Most years, the boundary stays where it was. Some years, very few, but some, it doesn't. And on those years, they move their livestock farther back from the edge. They tell their children to avoid that section of forest. They just watch the boundary and wait to see if next spring brings another shift, another slow expansion of winter, claiming ground where summer should hold. The door to spring closed in Miller's Hollow in late spring of 1840. It has never opened again. And some say, though only in whispers, and only to those who've seen the bare trees themselves, that winter is patient. Winter can wait, and winter, given enough time, will expand.